So we're starting this lecture on intimate partner violence, obviously a really important issue and a really common issue. And so many of you may have had personal experience with this with yourself or with loved ones, either being victims or being perpetrators, or kind of struggling with relationships getting a lot out of control and getting more kind of physically aggressive with each other. And so I just want to acknowledge that this material may stir things up, and I encourage you to kind of seek out your people, your supportive people, if you need kind of help, and let me know if I can provide more resources. So this typology of intimate partner violence was developed by Michael Johnson in the mid-1990s and became more kind of widely known in the early 2000s, and it's still such a landmark moment in the intimate partner violence field that changed how researchers and clinicians thought about domestic violence. And so the first form of violence, called coercive controlling violence, or CCV, it was initially called intimate terrorism, and that was just very recently changed, and so you're going to hear me in this lecture reference it as intimate terrorism sometimes. This is what we think about when we think about stereotypical domestic violence, the type that we hear in the movies or hear about in the news headlines. This is where one person is kind of making another person feel dominated, isolated, or micromanaged. It's control motivated, and it's often kind of broadly happening in the relationship or in these individuals' lives. So one person might be trying to control the other person's finances and their social life and their sexual acts and their parenting and their self-esteem, and so it's not kind of specific and situational. And data on CCV is generally drawn from arrest records, police reports, and also people who go to domestic violence shelters, which is typically women, but not always. There is what's called gender asymmetry, meaning that it's more perpetrated more severely by males and less by females, and in heterosexual relationships, and it's more unidirectional in heterosexual relationships, or to be honest, same-sex relationships where one person is perpetrating it more on the other, but in heterosexual it would be male to female. It's associated with more frequent acts of violence, more severe acts of violence, and when a couple separates, more issues afterwards: continued violence, stalking, harassment, and if they have kids, more co-parenting conflict. So then the real kind of new distinction or addition that Michael Johnson offered was this idea of situational couple violence, which was a long time ago called common couple violence, and people took issue with that word common. So situational couple violence is more conflict motivated. It's basically a situation that has gotten out of control. The couple has been unable to resolve their conflict. They're showing distressed communication. They can't resolve, maybe high contempt, high criticism, and then it escalates. SCV, the data from this is more drawn from community samples, people generally seeking therapy, not necessarily specifically because they're court mandated because of domestic violence, but maybe because they're experiencing conflict that they're struggling to resolve. This is the violence that shows up on behavioral checklists when we just survey a group of people and ask them if they've ever done or experienced any of these different things, like pushing someone or throwing something at your partner. Situational couple violence can tend to be more gender symmetric. So in different gender couples, both male and female partners, but also in same gender couples, right? More symmetry and can be bidirectional then. It's associated with less frequent and less severe violence and less post-separation continued intimate partner violence. So with situational couple violence, there's no attempt to control the person outside of the specific argument. There's no indication of a general pattern of control of one person over the other. And the motivation is generally that I just got frustrated and I wasn't thinking, not that I was trying to instill fear and establish control over my partner. Also, partners don't typically report that they're experiencing psychological, social, or economic consequences in their workplace, in their social networks, in their mental or physical health.
whereas they are more likely to report this with intimate terrorism. And a big hallmark is that with situational couple violence, they don't report being fearful. They often acknowledge the aggression honestly, admit that it's shameful, want to change. No one's really denying it, and no one's exhibiting a lot of fear.
So when we look at survey data, when we ask people, have you ever experienced any of these forms of intimate partner violence in your lifetime with a romantic partner, we will see kind of similar, somewhat similar rates between men and women. And this is partly because it's not taking into account type or the severity. So we might have 29% of men say they've experienced this, 37% of women, although that number goes up notably to 44% when it's women of color. So even though the quantity on survey data can look sometimes similar, when we look more closely, we see a different quality. So basically, women are much more likely to experience sexual violence, more severe physical violence, which can result in more injuries, experiencing multiple forms of violence like sexual and physical violence, and are, I think, 4 times more likely or even higher to be killed by their partners. Women who are being violent, for example, are more likely to report pushing, slapping, kicking, punching, hitting with objects, or throwing something at their partner, but they're more likely to report being the recipient of choking, slamming against the wall, arm twisting, sexual aggression, and coercive control. So definitely women are being violent too, but it seems to have a different quality to it, at least most of the time. And women who are arrested for intimate partner violence have, on average, shorter criminal records and are less likely to recommit any intimate partner violent crimes.
In the past, a couple of decades ago, couples therapists were just told that they could not do couples therapy with couples who had violence. But we've gotten more skilled at determining what types of violence historically are okay for couples therapy and what are not. And so the couples assessments are really in depth. This is just a quick snapshot, but typically couples therapists will meet with each member of the couple individually and ask some more in-depth questions to determine if they're appropriate for couples therapy. And if the violence is more in the past and not happening currently, that may be an indicator that they're okay for couples treatment. If they feel safe with one another and no one is afraid of the other, getting a sense of what the severity is and has been. A common question is to ask each person to tell me about your first, worst, and most recent incidents of violence. And we're also looking for whether or not they're congruent. So it would be a red flag if one person is mentioning a really severe incident in individual therapy that the other person isn't mentioning in their individual assessment. And then trying to determine whether or not it's more situational couple violence or intimate terrorism. And if it's ongoing intimate terrorism, then the couple is not appropriate for couples therapy.
So we have 3 different types of interventions for intimate partner violence. We have those for the offenders, those for the victims, and those for couples who are trying to stay together and are not having ongoing violence anymore. And then, just note that bullet point at the end there. It's really important that if there's ongoing substance abuse, which there often is, that we've got to be treating that, since that's such a risk factor for intimate partner violence. Okay, so for the groups that are typically male offenders, which is where the research has been done, this is usually resulting after an arrest, and it's been a court-mandated kind of DV treatment. There's treatment programs that are kind of officially approved for these court-mandated requirements. We have lists, for example, in Colorado of kind of approved DV offender groups or treatment. And so these are often men-only educational groups that focus on anger management or things like patriarchy and the power and control wheel. Unfortunately, we're really only seeing a small effect in reducing future DV episodes. It looks like at least 1 in 3 cases, arrests of intimate partner violence, will have a new episode in the next 6 months. And other research says that if you're arrested and not treated, you have basically 35% chance of staying nonviolent, but if you're treated, you have just a 40% chance of remaining nonviolent. So we haven't really kind of dialed in this intervention yet to be effective. On the other hand, the research, the meta-analyses on support for domestic violence victims, and I think a lot of this occurs within shelters, so it is people who have already kind of stepped out of, women who have already stepped out of their relationship, but it does show that it is pretty effective in reducing violence for mothers over the long term. And so this is often cognitive behavioral therapy kind of targeted at changing challenging thinking or challenging behaviors, trying to increase coping strategies. And so obviously we also hear things like it can take women, 7 times to leave before they actually leave a violent relationship. But this does seem to have some promising data. And then the last one is a couples treatment model developed by Sandy Stith, Eric McCullen, and Karen Rosen, something that we for a time used in the CFCT when we had a contract to provide treatment for couples with intimate partner violence. And this is an 18-week manualized intervention. It can be delivered most typically in a group format, but it could also be delivered individually to a couple. But the group format would look like male, it's a heterosexual model, so male and female groups, male and female therapist, starting off meeting separately with kind of regular screening each week to make sure that the couple was still remaining nonviolent and could be safe for a couple's intervention. And so, that's that couple's model. Each state has its own laws around what constitutes domestic violence. So these are the ones for Colorado, and you can see that there's this requirement that it's an intimate relationship or has been an intimate relationship. So this excludes, roommates or adult, parents and children or adult siblings kind of fighting with each other. And then you can see that it includes not only things like, physical assault of a person, it can also include harming their property, their animals, or kind of threatening to do those kinds of things in order to intimidate or control. So here in Colorado, domestic violence isn't a crime by itself. It's an enhancement to other criminal offenses. So your primary charge is harassment or assault or trespassing or stalking or destruction of property, but then it's with a DV or a domestic violence enhancer, which typically includes mandatory perpetrator treatment. So now we're going to head through a series of slides talking about elements of intimate partner violence, and just following from what we've talked about in terms of crimes, some of the things that we're talking about on some of these lists would constitute crimes, especially things maybe on the physical and sexual violence lists. But then some of the things, especially things more related to psychological aggression or economic aggression, those aren't going to be crimes, but they might still be a part of this overall pattern of intimate partner violence. And so here we look at the list of physical violence, and we can see that there's a whole range of actions, some of these more lethal than others. So definitely once you start putting your hands around someone's throat or pulling a weapon, those are more serious and kind of more predictive of more severe violence. But then you can also see that there's things that are not directly harming a partner, but basically being threatening physically around them, such as kind of punching the wall next to their head or throwing things or smashing their phone kind of next to them or things like that. Or denying medical treatment or forcing them to use substances. So many victims or survivors of intimate partner violence will say that the psychological or emotional or verbal abuse was almost harder because the physical was more clear, and this type of abuse was so much more kind of vague and nebulous. It was more crazy making, and it was hard to really determine if you were being abused or not. So the overall kind of theme here is, trying to make someone not feel good about themselves. And obviously we've all kind of done this to people. So this is on a continuum of kind of how extreme are we going. And so, we might have kind of ways that we are basically trying to talk to someone in a sense in order to kind of control them, to make them feel kind of isolated, like they don't deserve other people, to make them want to kind of just stay with you. That's kind of the intent here. Make them feel that they're powerless so that they defer to you. So, for example, we can all be jealous when our partners go out with friends, but we can kind of say that in a more kind of normal way, like I feel left out or I feel jealous. Or we can be more kind of extreme where we really don't, we put up such a protest that you don't ever feel like you can go out with your friends. And then if you do, we give you the silent treatment, or we threaten to harm ourselves, or, or we hurt you. So, all of this is just more on a continuum. And when it gets to be the part of an abusive relationship, it gets more extreme. That last, I think one of the hallmarks there also is that people who are on the other end of this start to feel crazy. They keep second guessing themselves all the time, particularly maybe around arguments. They feel like they can't ever win an argument. They start out kind of bringing up a concern or a complaint, and somehow it always gets kind of turned back on them. And some of us may have, the verbal skills to do this in relationships, and so we have to check ourselves that we are making sure that we take responsibility for things, that we're not always turning it back on our partner. Okay, so as you may have already learned, it's really only been recently that rape within a marriage is illegal. So it was legal. It wasn't even considered rape up until the late 1970s. And then in the late 1970s, 80s, and early 90s, states began to pass laws indicating that non-consenting, sex in a marriage is rape, although they often treated it differently as kind of less severe than if it was outside of a marriage. But we can see that even beyond intercourse, it could be forced participation in other sexual acts. And then sexual violence could also include just making demeaning or critical remarks about your partner's sexuality. It could be kind of threatening to have affairs or having affairs and flaunting them. And perhaps maybe even a little less commonly, it could also be, withholding intimacy as a tool to kind of control. Now, obviously, some of us could perhaps relate to that, like, I don't want to, be intimate with you because, you haven't done the chores or something like that. So this is going to be more on a more extreme continuum than just maybe basically kind of feeling low sexual desire because of conflict or something like that. So a lot of the things on this list wouldn't constitute crimes, with the exception kind of maybe with some harassment or stalking in the workplace. But here it can be all the things that we do financially to try to make it harder for our partner to leave us. And so you can kind of look over this list that we're going to kind of jeopardize their work, that we're going to restrict access to money, that we're going to kind of force them to work, and then kind of take the money. We're going to sabotage credit or kind of future finances to make it hard for them to leave us. I find stalking to be an interesting one because on the one hand, it's obviously if you've had this done to you, it can be a really scary thing. And I've kind of supported friends in having to get restraining orders for kind of ex-partners who are stalking them. But on the other hand, there's a part of me that can relate to that desire to stalk. I think I could have a little bit of a stalker in me. If someone broke up with me, I could want to do some of these things, right? Drive by their house, drive by their work, text them, call them, beg them, to come back to me. So again, we have to first acknowledge that there's a whole continuum here. And so this is kind of more when it starts to get more extreme, even when someone has told you to stop. And we also have to kind of watch ourselves with these impulses where we might want to engage in behaviors that could be perceived as stalking. And so this last slide is just how we might use legal systems to control someone. We might threaten to have them arrested for their illegal behavior. This could be all kinds of things, or such as like drug use or immigration status, or stuff like that. Or we could make them feel like they're crazy and that they could be committed, which certainly happened to a lot of women historically. Or we could try to indicate that they were an unfit parent and that we were going to call Child Protective Services on them, and that they would lose custody of kids. So the research on same-sex couples is more limited, and if we had to do a kind of give a generalization, we might say that it appears to be similar rates as cross-sex couples. More research has been done on lesbians than gay male couples. There's some research that it says it can just as easily be intimate terrorism, and then other research that says it might be more likely to be kind of bidirectional situational couple violence. In terms of dating relationships, and this is research mostly on heterosexual couples, this intimate partner violence is usually lower, although it obviously does happen in dating relationships, because people are more likely to end that relationship sooner if there's violence or it just hasn't had a chance to really get going yet. However, it is correlated with teen pregnancy, and so this is just something as interventionists that's important for us to keep in mind, that if we're working with a young couple or individuals, young teens who are pregnant, we want to be screening for intimate partner violence. And if we're working on an issue of dating violence, we want to worry about being kind of women being coerced into sexual activity or not being able to use kind of contraception. Cohabiting couples show the highest rates of intimate partner violence, and this appears to be because people who get married self-select out. So it's a more narrow population that gets married. If you're living with someone and you're violent, you're less likely to go on to get married. But if you're cohabiting, you've kind of been together long enough for that cycle of violence to amp up. You've probably heard the data on that the risk of severe and fatal violence is highest when a woman tries to leave a relationship. So during kind of divorce, separation and divorce processes, it kind of can create this anxiety about abandonment from the perpetrator, and then they can kind of be more threatening of violence or also their own suicidality. And so just a related research study on emerging adult college students found that violence was more present when the college student couple was unstably kind of in limbo about whether or not they were staying together or breaking up.
Most of the research that has been done on predictors of intimate partner violence has been done on male perpetrators, not female perpetrators. And these findings would be reflected globally, not just in the U.S. So these are all factors to keep in mind if you're working with families. If you start to see a number of these factors popping up, then you might have a question in the back of your head as to whether or not intimate partner violence is occurring. And you can see that some of these are associated with the male's experience and his background and whether or not he's experienced abuse. Others of these factors are associated with the stress associated with having less money and less education. And then some of them are, the last one being about kind of what's happening in the couple. And obviously we learned in attachment theory that when a couple has high demand withdrawal and insecurely attached, that puts them at risk for conflicts escalating into violence.
So given that we pay more attention to theory in this class, I thought I would highlight some of the theories that are kind of used in intimate partner violence research. So obviously social learning theory, which we don't cover in this class, but just that idea of that we are often modeling our behaviors about what we have seen before us, so maybe people who are being abusive have watched people be abusive growing up, or maybe those who are victims have kind of watched that pattern growing up. And then relatedly is the life course perspective, which we do talk about in this class, which is just this idea that we could have kind of early experiences in our lives that put us on trajectories. So adolescents who are, for example, victims in dating relationships are more likely to be victimized in young adulthood as well. And then, you know, that concept of linked lives, oftentimes we know that intimate partner violence patterns perpetuate. So if we had experienced that growing up, we're more at risk to perpetuate that as we get older. Feminist theory or gender theory basically also helps us understand how we socialize males and females to maybe put them at risk for women being victims and males being perpetrators. So that would be kind of more of a heterosexist model. And then also that kind of related to what we read about with Michael Johnson, that there's a difference between meaning and behavior. And so slapping someone on the face is different depending upon the gender of the perpetrator. Even though I would say it's not great for women to slap men either. Boy, if you watch old movies, that happens all the time. And yet that would have a different meaning for us than a male slapping a female across the face. Social exchange theory can help us understand, for example, why in heterosexual relationships some women leave and some women stay, and that's that women compare what their alternatives are without their abusive partner, and if they think they're going to be worse off, for example, financially, or he's never going to leave them alone anyway, they might not go through the divorce process. But if they think their prospects are better, then they're more likely to divorce. And so sometimes what we're doing in treatment is helping women get to the point where they think that their prospects could be better. And then attachment insecurity, not surprisingly, predicts both victimization and perpetration. So violent men often report more anxiety over abandonment, more need for nurturance, hypervigilance to their partner, more jealousy, essentially a more anxious attachment style. So the developmental systems model isn't one that we typically talk about, at least I don't, in other HDFS classes, but is particularly useful here in thinking about intimate partner violence. And so basically we all have some level of family risk, and higher risk in families would be economic disadvantage and stress, and basically parents who are struggling to parent well, you know, they're more disengaged, they are harsher. And so then this is correlated with adolescents either externalizing behavior like conduct problems or internalizing behavior like depressive symptoms. It's also associated with hanging out basically with other teens who are likely to be kind of getting into trouble, maybe with externalizing risky behaviors. And so then this peer group kind of feeds into you choosing a partner who's within your peer group, or this assortative partnering or mating idea, which is that you choose a partner who is similar to you on specific traits, so maybe has similar background or similar kind of risk context, and then this then puts you more at risk for experiencing intimate partner violence and struggling with it.
So in other classes we talk about the genetic and environment interaction framework, and one of those being differential susceptibility, which is also called the orchidandelion hypothesis, which is just the idea that genetically some individuals are more sensitive to their environment. Basically, they react more positively in positive environments. These are orchids, and they react more negatively in negative environments. But dandelions, on the other hand, are less influenced by their environment, whether it's positive or negative. And there are some genes associated with aggressive behavior that demonstrate this. So emerging adults with the less common variant of the GABRA2 gene were more aggressive later in life to their partners if they were harshly parented themselves, but they were less aggressive if their parents were supportive. So they were more extreme depending upon their childhood environment, either doing the best or doing the worst.
This is simply a graphical representation of the research that was presented on the previous slide, basically showing that in terms of later hostility to a romantic partner, for the dandelions, the level of harsh parenting they received really didn't have predictive power. That line is pretty flat, you can see. But for the orchids who had the plasticity alleles of the GABRA2 gene to make them more kind of influenced by their environment, they really did show an effect based on how harshly they were parented in terms of later hostility in romantic relationships.